Mr. Elder, thank you so much for joining us today. It's going to be fun to meet with you and hear your ideas on our questions. I'm Tad Weber. I'm the opinion editor at the Fresno Bee. So as you very well know, I'm sure, California is the world's 5th largest economy. It's the most populous state in America. It's a trendsetter and leader in technology, agriculture, and entertainment. So the task of governing such a powerhouse is daunting. So the question for you to start this off, please tell us specifically what experience you have in running complicated organizations and what qualifies you specifically to think you can become California's next governor.
Well, I would respond by saying, what experience and qualifications does the incumbent have? He was the mayor of San Francisco. For 8 years, he was lieutenant governor, had all sorts of time to think about what he would do were he to become governor. He's now been governor for 2 years. And look at what we got. We've got rising crime. We have rising homelessness. We have a rising cost of living. And he has shut down this state in a more severe way than any of the other 49 states, while, in my opinion, flaunting the very mandates that he was imposing on everybody else. We know about the famous French Laundry restaurant where he sat there with the lobbyists and medical professionals who drafted the very mandates he was ignoring by not wearing masks and by not engaging in social distancing. I also would remind you that there was a gentleman who came out of Hollywood who was not on talk radio for 27 years, as I have been, was not on in every major market in California, from Sacramento down to San Diego, was not a syndicated columnist for some 23 years, as I am. A column carried in the LA Daily News, carried in the Orange County Register. He came out of Hollywood and he became a pretty good 2-term governor and a pretty good president. I'm not comparing myself to Ronald Reagan. What I am saying is that sometimes political experience doesn't tell you anything if you don't have common sense and good judgment. I am from California. My father came here in 1945, right after the war. He worked 2 full-time jobs as a janitor cleaning toilets. And even with that meager income, he was able to save his nickels and dimes and purchase a home that's still in the family in South Central Los Angeles that is now worth $600,000. Somebody with an 8th grade dropout education like my father could not duplicate his path from poverty to the middle class if he worked 3 jobs. That's because the cost of living has gotten so outrageous here in California, largely because of CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, that enables virtually anybody to stop anything for almost any reason. That's why the average price of a home in California is $800,000. The average price of a home in California is 150% the national average. And I think I can do something about that. One of the frequent guests I have on my radio program is an economist, brilliant economist named Leo Hanian. He teaches at UCLA, and he says because of CEQA and other policies, the average price of a home in California is literally 50% more than it otherwise would be. I know it's a long way of answering your question, but I think it's about common sense and good judgment, and I think I've got that.
Okay, let's assume for a second, for discussion's sake, the recall is successful and you do get elected to be.
Don't be so pessimistic. It's in the margin of error right now. It's in the margin of error. About half want it gone, about half don't. So there's a very good chance that this guy could be recalled, and there's a good chance that I might be able to succeed him. Don't ruin my mood.
Okay, so you become the next governor of California. What are the first 3 things you do as you take over?
Well, one of the things I'm going to do is declare a statewide emergency on homelessness. One of the reasons we have the homelessness problem is because of the price of housing that I mentioned just a moment ago. And even when and if we're successful in getting people off the streets and make them self-sufficient, or at least get them off the streets so that donors can subsidize their lifestyle, where are they going to go? We don't have low-cost housing. We don't have low-cost apartments here in California because of CEQA, which, by the way, was waived when a billionaire wanted to build the stadium for the Sacramento Kings. I'm also going to do something about education. I'm going to be a strong proponent of school choice. My understanding is that there very well might be a ballot initiative that would set up something like education savings accounts so that the money follows the child rather than the other way around. So parents are in charge of their education of their children. I'm going to be a big proponent of that. I'm also going to be talking about crime. We have a couple of DAs in the Bay Area, San Francisco, and in Los Angeles. George Soros appointed DAs. The DA in LA was appointed, by the way, as DA in San Francisco by my opponent, by Gavin Newsom. They're both soft on crime. They both believe in cashless bail. And I'm going to urge the recall of those two DAs. They're already facing a recall election. And if I can give a voice to that effort as governor from my bully pulpit, I'm going to do that. I'm also going to turn down the rhetoric. This business about the police engaging in systemic racism is false. It's a lie. There have been many studies showing, if anything, the police are more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger on a Black suspect than a white suspect. And what's happened is police, because of this false accusation, are engaging in what's called passive policing as opposed to proactive policing. They're pulling back. Bad guys know it. Crime goes up. And the very people who are disproportionately hurt by that are Black and brown people. I'm also not going to do what this governor has done. He's overseen the release of some 20,000 people, 20,000 convicted felons, many of whom are violent offenders during COVID. And the stats show that majority of them are likely to reoffend. That's why Barbara Boxer, just a few days ago, was mugged by somebody in the Bay Area in Oakland. And even Gavin Newsom several months ago was assaulted by a homeless person. But Gavin Newsom had a security detail and that protected him. Most of us don't have security detail. Crime doesn't have a color. Homelessness doesn't have a color. The rising cost of living doesn't have a color. So I'm going to do something about crime, homelessness, and the cost of living in my first several days if I'm fortunate enough to become governor.
Mr. Elder, I have the next question. I'll reintroduce myself. My name is Marco Spertone. I am California opinion editor for McClatchy Newspapers. It's a pleasure to meet you. Before I ask my question, though, I wanted to ask a follow-up to what you just said at the end there. You referred to studies showing that police were more hesitant. Could you let us, what studies are you referring to?
Well, there is a big article I urge everybody to read in the Washington Post, April 27, 2016. The reason I know that date is because that's my birth date. And they talk about studies going back over decades, including from researchers at Washington State University. I believe it's Washington State, not University of Washington, but it's one of those two in Washington State. That's talked about their research going back over decades, where they do simulations of police officers, and they find that the police officers are 3 times more hesitant to pull the trigger on a Black suspect than on a white suspect. Also, there's a front page article in the New York Times, same year, 2016, about a Harvard economist named Roland Fryer. Roland Fryer is so brilliant. He is Harvard's youngest tenured professor in its history, and Harvard is the oldest college in America, if I'm not mistaken. And he assumed that because of the high profile deaths of people like Freddie Gray in Baltimore, Tamir Rice in Cleveland, Eric Gardner in New York, of course, Michael Brown in Ferguson, that the police were in fact engaging in the use of disproportionate force against Black suspects compared to white suspects. After his research, he said it was the most surprising finding of my professional career. He found not only were the police not engaging in lethal, deadly force against Blacks excessively, he found, as did the researchers at the other institution I mentioned, he found police were more hesitant, more reluctant to pull the trigger on a Black suspect than a white suspect. It's a lie. Now, a lot of people on the left believe in lies, and many lies are just simply innocuous. This is not an innocuous lie because it does 2 things. As I mentioned, it calls the police to pull back. It's called the Ferguson effect or the George Floyd effect. It also causes young Black men who falsely believe this narrative to refuse to comply. Virtually every one of these deaths could have been avoided had the suspect complied. I've often said, comply, you won't die. But if you're a young Black person who's been indoctrinated with this false narrative that when I get pulled over by a cop, the cop's going to do something bad to me, why should a cop cooperate? My father always told me, whenever I got pulled over, make sure your left hand is at 10 o'clock, your right hand is at 2 o'clock. Make sure your paperwork is in order. Say yes, sir, say no, sir. And if you feel you're mistreated, get a badge number and settle it later on. That is not happening because of this false narrative that a lot of young Black men are buying into. And I think it's hideous.
So you don't believe that Black men are disproportionately involved in police-involved shootings?
I didn't say that. I said I don't believe that the police are disproportionately using deadly force against Black people. The #1 cause of preventable death of young white boys, young white men, is accidents, like car accidents or drownings. The #1 cause of preventable death for young Black men is homicide, almost always at the hands of another young Black man. That is why the cops are in the neighborhood. But that is because of the family breakdown. If I could just say a little something about that. Back in 1965, a nouveau liberal named Lyndon Johnson launched what he called the War on Poverty. At the time, 25% of Black kids entered the world without a father married to the mother. Now, you and I could have a discussion about to what degree that 25% is because of slavery and Jim Crow. But right now, that number is almost 70% of Black children brought into the world without a father married to the mother. And forget about elder. Barack Obama once said a kid raised without a father is 5 times more likely to be poor and commit crime, 9 times more likely to drop out of school, and 20 times more likely to end up in jail. Now, we ought to be asking ourselves, how have we gone from 25% of Black children brought into the world without a father married to the mother in 65 versus nearly 70% now? And I argue that it's because of the welfare state. What we've done with the welfare state is we've incentivized women to marry the government, and we've allowed men to abandon their financial and moral responsibility. And it's not just Black families, nearly 50% of Hispanic families, children are brought into the world without a father married to the mother. And now 25% of white kids enter the world without a father married to the mother. 40% of all kids in America today enter the world without a father married to the mother, and it is a product of the welfare state. And I think we ought to be talking about that far more often, instead of talking about things like systemic racism and falsely accusing the police officers of engaging in it.
We're going to ask you a lot of questions today, Mr. Elder, mostly on the state, but since the governor of California will also be a leader in the nation, we want to address that. So the question I would ask next is, among conservatives, there is a growing quorum who distrust elections and election officials, including in California. Do you believe Joe Biden won the 2020 election freely and fairly? And do you trust in the integrity and validity of California's elections process?
I do believe that Joe Biden won the election fairly and squarely, but can I say something about that? I know Donald Trump has been accused of fomenting the big lie. If I had a nickel every time I watch CNN, and I watch a lot of CNN, I watch Chris Cuomo and Don Lemon and Wolf Blitzer. If I had a dime every time they said Donald Trump has pushed the big lie, I could self-fund my campaign. I want to point out that for 4 years and counting, Hillary Clinton referred to the 2016 election as having been stolen, her word, not mine. She referred to Donald Trump for 4 years and counting as illegitimate, her word, not mine. When the Senate investigated the 2016 election, they made 2 major findings. One of them was this, that despite their efforts, the Russians failed to change a single vote tally. Yet, according to a YouGov poll, a respected poll, 66% of Democrats believe that the Russians changed vote tallies. One more time, the Senate report found 0 evidence that the Russians changed a single vote tally. Now, the politics editor of CNN is a man named Chris Cillizza. He wrote a piece where he excoriated Republicans for, quote, falsely believing that there was, quote, widespread voter fraud in the 2020 election. 76% of Republicans, he said, believes this lie. 78% of Democrats believe that the Russians, quote, changed the outcome of the election, close quote, in 2016, even though the Senate report could not find any evidence one way or the other. Mostly what the Russians did, as you know, is buy a bunch of Facebook ads, some pro-Black, some anti-Black, some pro-Trump, some anti-Trump, some pro-Hillary, some anti-Hillary, in order to just stir up discontent. But the Intel report found no evidence whatsoever that the Russians changed the vote, changed the outcome of the election or not. Yet 78% of Democrats, according to Gallup, believe that the outcome of the election was changed by the Russian interference in 2016. Yet Hillary's social media was never shut down, even though she was promoting the big lie. Social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook never shut her down, even though she was promoting the big lie. Now, when I say that, people push back and say, well, Hillary conceded the election, Donald Trump did not. Google Donald Trump and concede, and you'll find numerous articles where Donald Trump conceded the election. I agree he didn't concede it right away, but ultimately he did. And neither Hillary nor Donald Trump used the C word, concede. The second pushback is, well, Hillary did not sue to overturn the election. Au contraire, mon frere, she joined Jill Stein and Jill Stein's lawsuit to overturn the election in Wisconsin and filed a separate motion to have the recount done by hand. Third, Hillary's supporters did not storm the Capitol on January 6th. That is true, because Hillary was not president on January 6th. But on election night in November 2016, there was widespread violence on the part of Hillary supporters all over America, including clashes with the police, including police cars being burned. And on the 3rd week of January in 2017, when Donald Trump was inaugurated, 200 people were arrested in Washington, D.C. because of violent protests. That's almost half of the 400 people that were arrested on January 6th. So I believe there's a double standard here. Donald Trump has been pounded and pounded and pounded for promoting the so-called big lie. Hillary has promoted the big lie for 4 years and counting, and has never, ever been, in my opinion, upbraided over that. And finally, Donald Trump, to my knowledge, never referred to Barack Obama as having stolen the 28 election or the 2012 election, and never referred to him as illegitimate during the 8 years of his presidency. But Hillary, as I repeat, referred to Donald Trump as having stolen the election in 2016 and being illegitimate. I think there's a double standard here, and I wish the media would acknowledge that.
I'm going to go to Yusuf Beg next, but Donald Trump, well into Obama's presidency, promoted the lie that he was not born in the United States.
May I respond to that, please?
Of course.
You're with McClatchy newspapers. That lie was promoted by Hillary's campaign, particularly Sidney Blumenthal, and one of your reporters named James Asher, who was, I think, the DC bureau chief, was approached by Sidney Blumenthal during the campaign, and Sidney Blumenthal told him that Barack Obama was from Africa, to the point where Asher put a reporter to track down the rumor, found no basis for the rumor whatsoever. And I'm not saying Donald Trump did not promote this birther business, and I never supported it. I condemned it when I was on the air, but the original person that pushed the birther lie was Sidney Blumenthal, who was working for Hillary Clinton during the 2008 campaign, and your own newspaper acknowledged it.
Let's go to Yusuf Beg.
Hi, Larry. Yusuf Beg. I'm the assistant opinion editor with the Bee. I want to ask you about COVID, but I have to address this false equivalency too that you're raising with Hillary Clinton and what happened at the Capitol on January 6th. There are multiple police officers who died that day trying to defend the Capitol. There have been multiple who have committed suicide in the aftermath of that event. And to say that any vandalism that occurred in cities when people were protesting after Trump's election is not the same thing.
I didn't say they were the same thing. I said they both pushed a lie, and I wish that Hillary would be called on her lie.
I didn't call it a double standard.
I didn't say they were the same thing. What happened on January 6th was outrageous. Everybody there should be accountable. It was a riot, and in no way, shape, or form do I support it. I also know that there was widespread violence all over the country, in major cities, all over America, the several days after Donald Trump won the election in November, and there was widespread violence in Washington, D.C. during the inauguration, the third week of January in 2017. And we ought to be talking about that as well.
But that was after Hillary had conceded the election. Trump had not conceded. He had a rally on the footsteps in D.C. It was a completely different scenario.
Donald Trump also said, I want you to go peacefully and make your voices heard. Why do people ignore the part where he said peacefully? To act as if Donald Trump put a red flag in front of people and said, go trash the Capitol building, to me is quite unfair.
Okay, well, let's change to something else to talk about California. Let's talk about COVID.
Sure.
Counties throughout California are reimposing mask mandates, with the Delta variant now accounting for 83% of new infections and almost all hospitalizations nationwide. Many Republicans flout public health rules and try to discredit experts like Dr. Fauci and agencies like the CDC. As governor, would you follow the guidance of experts? And if the FDA was to fully approve the vaccine in the coming months, would you support a vaccine requirement for all eligible Californians? I
would not support a vaccine mandate. I would not support a mask mandate. I have been vaccinated. I believe vaccines work. I'm an old man. I have comorbidities. I support people to get the vaccine. But in California, virtually everybody who wants to get the vaccine has been able to get one. Poor people can get the vaccine for free. So a lot of people have made the choice, rightly or wrongly, not to get a vaccine. And I think in America, you ought to have that choice.
Jack Oman, I'm the Deputy California Opinion Editor and Editorial Cartoonist. Mr. Elder, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
In your torrent of words, you said earlier that
torrent of words.
Yes, torrent. You said that George Soros.
When you start out by saying torrent of words, it sounds to me like the sentence is not going to end well. But let's go.
No. You said that you used the phrase George Soros appointed DAs.
I think I said supported, but if I said appointed, I made a mistake. He funded them.
Did other people fund those races, such as Gascons and Boudins?
I don't know exactly who paid what, but my impression is without George Soros's money, probably neither one of them would have been elected. Gascon replaced a Black female DA in LA, the first Black female we ever had. And in my opinion, but for his money, she likely would have gotten reelected.
Okay, but what's the implication here? that George Soros?
Well, the implication is that George Soros, these DAs are soft on crime. They believe in cashless bail. That's why they're facing recall elections. That's why DAs in San Francisco and DAs in Los Angeles are both hopping mad at both of them. And that's one of the reasons I believe that crime has gone up in those two cities.
You're on record as calling for the end to the minimum wage, saying, quote, the correct minimum wage ought to be zero.
Right.
How do you think California voters currently earning the minimum wage, which is $13 to $14 an hour, would react to that?
Well, given the indoctrination that people have about the minimum wage, they probably wouldn't react to it well. I would point out that there was editorial in 1987 in the New York Times, an editorial, not op-ed piece, and the headline is correct minimum wage 0.00. And they made all the economic 101 arguments. That is that when you arbitrarily increase the cost of labor, all sorts of bad consequences come from that. People's hours are cut back, a hiring decision is deferred, prices of goods go up in order to compensate for that forced increase in labor, which is usually the biggest cost in running any kind of business. Milton Friedman, the Nobel laureate economist, who was a friend of mine, said that he believes that the minimum wage was, quote, the most anti-Negro law on the statute books, close quote, because at one time, believe it or not, a Black teenager was more likely to be employed than a white teenager, more likely to be employed than a white adult, more likely to be employed than a Black adult, because that teenager was able to sell his labor for less. When you come in with the minimum wage, you are foreclosing the ability of people, often with little education and little skills, to get a job. I never have quite understood why a third party like government, why that government feels it's anybody's business what my relationship is with an individual who willingly sold his labor and my relationship with that person when I willingly bought that labor. Why two people who are adults can't determine what the price of labor ought to be is beyond me. And why a third party feels it's his or her business to interfere with that is also beyond me. I'd also like to say this about the minimum wage. I was not at this meeting, but the governor, the mayor of Los Angeles is Eric Garcetti. Eric Garcetti went to the London School of Economics. He didn't study economics. He studied ethnic studies, but you'd think even by osmosis, he might pick up something from Adam Smith or from some of the books that might be lying around. When the minimum wage was proposed to be raised to $12 an hour, he brought in a bunch of business people. And I know this because 2 or 3 of them called my radio show and said 20 or 30 of us were invited to this meeting, and all of us came in with our profit and loss statements. We all told him that our profit margins were razor thin, and when you're forcing us to raise labor, raise the cost of labor, we're going to have to lay off some people, we're going to have to defer hiring decisions, we're going to have to raise prices, all of which are negative. And he said, all 3 of them told me independently that Eric Garcetti listened very intently, stood up, buttoned his coat, and said to these people that are working 60, 70, 80 hours a week, because if you run a small business, you can't work 9 to 5. He stood up, buttoned his coat, and said, I believe you can absorb the cost. Now, as far as I know, this guy's never even run a lemonade stand telling hardworking businessmen and women, I'm going to jack up your price of labor, and you're just going to be able to deal with it, and walks out of the room. I think that's outrageous. It's offensive to me. I studied economics. I didn't major in it, but I studied economics in college. And again, this is a very difficult thing to do, to run a small business. Almost half of them fail. Those that do succeed often run on very thin margins, run from from payroll to payroll. And for somebody who's never run a business to tell business people who are working this hard, I'm going to jack up your price of labor and you're going to deal with it, to me is offensive. So yes, the ideal minimum wage is 0.00.
All right, our next question will be asked by Stephanie Finucane.
Good morning, Mr. Elder.
Morning.
I'm Stephanie Finucane. I'm the opinion editor at the Tribune in San Luis Obispo. And I'm going to return to the topic of systemic racism. On your website, you say it's outrageous that America is being demonized as systemically racist. Yet that seems to fly in the face of what we see around us in our reporting. For example, Tad Weber just completed a series on redlining in Fresno and how it prevented Black, Asian, and Latino people from buying property in preferred areas, and that has ramifications to this day. A national survey just ranked West Fresno as one of the worst places in the nation for a Black person to live, and it was the only place in the West to receive such a bad ranking. How do you respond to that?
Well, back in 1991, there was a Black Harvard sociologist named Orlando Patterson. He's still there. 1991. And he said, America, despite its flaws, is the least racist majority society in the world, provides more opportunities for Blacks than any other country in the world, including all of those of Africa. 1997, Time Magazine, CNN, Time teamed up to do a study of Black teens and white teens. And they asked them both whether racism was a major problem in America. Again, this is 1997, and both of them said yes. But then they did something that I've rarely seen any study do. They asked Black teens if racism was a big problem, a small problem, or no problem in your own daily life. 89% of Black teens called racism a small problem or no problem in their own daily life. In fact, more Black teens than white teens said failure to take advantage of available opportunities is a bigger problem than racism. I want to repeat that. More Black teens than white teens said, and this is pretty much verbatim, failure to take advantage of available opportunities is a bigger problem than racism, end of quote. Finally, I want to say this. I've often said this to people who make the same arguments that you've made. I'm talking about America today. I'm talking about America that elected a Black president and re-elected the Black president, even though he supervised over one of the worst economic recoveries since 1949. Pick up your magic wand, wave it over the hearts of America. Remove every smidgen of racism from white people. Now everybody white thinks like Mother Teresa. Do we still have a situation where 70% of Black children enter the world without a father married to the mother? Do we still have a situation where in many of our urban schools, there's a 50% dropout rate in high school? Do we still have a situation where even those in these urban high schools who do graduate can often not read, write, and compute at grade level? Do we still have a situation where the #1 cause of preventable death for young white men is accidents like car accidents and drownings, whereas the #1 cause of preventable death for young Black boys is homicide? If the answer to those series of questions is yes, I submit to you that systemic racism is not the problem, and things like critical race theory and reparations are not the answer.
All right, panelists, be aware, I'm going to go a little bit out of order so we can bring Hannah Holzer up. So Hannah Holzer will ask the next question.
Mr. Elder, my name is Hannah Holzer and I'm opinion assistant at the Sacramento Bee. I have a couple of questions for you, but I want to start with this one. I want to ask about your decision to name drop Sidney Blumenthal and George Soros. Regardless of your feelings about either, the names of both Jewish men have repeatedly been used by the right, the alt-right in particular, as anti-Semitic dog whistles. According to The Atlantic, Sidney Blumenthal isn't and never was a birther, so why did you use his name?
For crying out loud. You know, your newspaper endorsed Gavin Newsom. Your newspaper also believes that the recall election is a waste of time. So let's start with that premise. I have no idea what Sidney Blumenthal's religion is. I mention it because it's a fact that the McClatchy newspaper, a man named James Asher, said he was approached by a man named Sidney Blumenthal, a longtime hatchet man for Hillary, and he told James Asher that Barack Obama was from Africa. It is a fact that George Soros has funded these two DAs. Whether he's a Jew, a Muslim, a Satanist is irrelevant. Those are facts. And that you would suggest or imply that somehow I'm being anti-Semitic when I have been a friend of Jews, a friend of Israel, is absolutely outrageous. I have written an article called The Strange Phenomenon of Black Anti-Semitism. And I pointed out that in the Black community, most Blacks are not anti-Semitic, but the percentage of Blacks who are anti-Semitic is 2.5 times the percentage of Americans who are non-Black Gentiles. I've talked about the work that a man named Julius Rosenwald did in working with Booker T. Washington to build over 5,000 schools in the South during the Jim Crow era. At one time, 1 out of 4 Black children was educated in a Rosenwald school. I've talked about the fact that nearly 50% of the freedom riders, those who were trained to fight the segregation laws on transportation on those buses in the early 60s, 200 of them were white, 200 of them were Black, 75% of the white ones were Jews. I've talked about the fact that the famous movie called Mississippi Burning, which was about the, I think it was 1964 murder of 3 people, Messrs. Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney. 2 of the 3 were Jews. I have once been called a flag-waving, Jew-loving Uncle Tom. And I've often said, I'll cop to two of the three, but not the third one. So for you to imply that somehow I'm being anti-Semitic is offensive to me. But coming from the Sacramento Bee that supported this man, that supported my opponent, and that believes that the recall election is a waste of time, I'm not surprised.
Okay, thank you for your answer. I'm going to move on to the second question, unless anyone has any follow-ups.
Go right ahead.
Thanks. In July, you tweeted out a story about a West Virginia judge blocking a law that bans transgender students from girls' sports using the hashtag "We've Got a Country to Save." Do you support the rights of individuals to play on the sports teams or use the restrooms that correspond with the gender they identify with, even if that's not the gender they were assigned at birth? And would you call yourself an ally to the LGBTQ community?
I call myself an ally to human beings, irrespective of their gender, irrespective of their sexual orientation. I don't think it is fair for a male transgender athlete to compete against a biological female athlete. I just don't think that's fair. I believe even Caitlyn Jenner has the same position. And one time, Martina Navratilova had the same position until she got hammered by the LGBT community, and she then began to walk away from that position. So I think that's just common sense.
So let me just make this personal for a second. My sister is transgender. She's lived her life as a woman for many years now. So would you not allow her to use the woman's restroom?
If she is made a transition from being a male to a female, a transition that has been done by whatever medical intervention there is, I see no reason why she ought not be able to use whatever bathroom she identifies as.
Okay, thank you. And my last question for you is this. You've said that you do believe in climate change and global warming, but you also said that you're unsure whether the changing climate is playing a role in our state's worsening wildfires. Are you able to confidently say that there is a link that exists between climate change and wildfires?
I think it is a factor. And what I've said is I do believe in climate change. I do believe our climate is getting warmer, and I do believe that human activity has something to do with it. What I don't believe in is climate change alarmism. I don't believe, as AOC does, I think she said 2 years ago that if we don't take dramatic action, we're all going to die. That's a paraphrase, but she said something to that effect. I think that's outrageous. I think we're smart enough to deal with the effects of climate change. And if there's rising water, we can deal with the effects of that. I also think there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. We have people like Barack Obama, who just purchased a home on the water in Martha's Vineyard for $12.7 million. I don't know whether or not he took out a 30-year mortgage, but if he really is concerned about rising waters, why would somebody buy a house right on the water like that when the water is going to rise and flood the whole part, and we're going to have all these catastrophic consequences that people like AOC are promoting? And I think it really is a shame that so many young people are afraid about their future because so many people like AOC are convincing people that unless dramatic action is taken, we're all going to suffer all sorts of negative consequences. And this idea of forcing us to go away from a fossil-based economy to a renewables-based economy when the renewables are not nearly as cost-effective, there are trade-offs here, and they're not nearly as unreliable, is also, I think, unfair because it drives up energy costs, and the people who pay those energy costs are disproportionately poor people because energy will take a larger bite out of their paycheck than it will for upper-income people.
All right, Mr. Elder, we're going to return to Yusuf Beg.
Larry, I want to follow up on that briefly. California obviously fancies itself as a leader in climate change policy and greenhouse gas reduction goals. Would you change anything that's in motion right now to, if you were a governor, and how would you respond then in an appropriate way in your eyes to the changing climate and all the things that we're seeing?
Well, I think one of the problems is we've demonized nuclear. We only have one remaining nuclear plant, that's Diablo. We've shut down San Onofre, and it's had a real consequence. And when I talk about this, people's hair get on fire because they think about 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. Well, the technology is so much better than it was. And nobody, by the way, died at 3 Mile Island. And I think that I should make a case for the construction of nuclear power plants. They're clean burning. They're safer than they used to be. And I think that there are trade-offs on everything. And I also think that we have not invested in any real infrastructure for water and for energy in something like 40 years when the state was nearly half the population. One of the people that I've consulted with when I decided to run is Bill Jones. Bill Jones is the last Secretary of State who was a Republican, third-generation farmer, and he tells me that the infrastructure for water has not been appreciably added to in nearly 40 some odd years. I don't know what people are doing in Sacramento when our state has been growing and growing and growing. And again, forget about Elder. There's a magazine called The Atlantic Magazine, which is center left, and they just published an article not long ago called The California Dream is Dying, talking about the failure of us to prepare for energy, the failure of us to prepare for the growing water needs and the high cost of living. And they talked about a lot of young people leaving California. And as you well know, for the first time in our state's history, to my knowledge, people are leaving California. There's a net migration out of California. And when you're looking at people making between $50,000 and $100,000 a year, when they leave, the number one reason that they cite is the high cost of living. And that was one of the big points made in this long article in The Atlantic called The California Dream is Dying.
All right, so I apologize to Panos. I know we're jumping all over the place, but before I move on, I just want to be sure if our colleague Stephanie Finucane wanted to follow up on the nuclear power issue, or should I just continue?
No, that would be great if I could just briefly ask.
All right, so I will yield the floor to Stephanie.
Thank you. Do you support keeping Diablo Canyon open?
I do.
Okay, that's all I needed. Thank you.
I think it's to be decommissioned in about 3 or 4 or 5 years. And just as when San Onofre was decommissioned, I think it led to some of these rolling brownouts. Again, things are trade-offs. Nothing is easy, nothing is pure. But I think the failure of our leaders to explain to Californians that there are trade-offs here is one of the reasons that we're in the situation that we're in right now. We've passed water bond after water bond after water bond, infrastructure bond after infrastructure bond after infrastructure bond, billions of dollars set aside to build up on our infrastructure. And what happens? They study, lawsuit, and nothing's happening. And now we have a state that's 100% bigger than it was back in the 1970s, and we're not preparing for it. And I think that's outrageous.
I'm going to apologize again because I'm going to ask a question now, and then I'm going to turn to our colleague Tad Weber. But going back to one of the things you said earlier, you said that you would declare a homeless emergency. Mm-hmm. What would that mean? And how would that get people off the streets? What are the first 3 or 4 things that would be done in a homeless emergency? Well,
the homelessness emergency would be done to suspend CEQA so that I could unleash the developers and contractors who would be able to build low-cost housing and low-cost apartments. CEQA allows almost anybody to stop anything for almost any length of time. I've talked to a lot of developers, and a lot of them are completely demoralized, disillusioned, and many of them are building outside of California precisely because of that. I would also urge churches to get involved. Government does not know how to solve the homelessness problem. They think it's just about building houses first without dealing with the underlying reason why some people are on the streets. We have a certain percentage of people who are on the streets who are simply schizophrenic. By that, I mean of danger to themselves or to others. I mentioned that Gavin Newsom was attacked by a homeless man, and he was defended by his security detail. And so some percentage, I'm not sure how many, literally have to be removed from the street and put in mental institutions for their own safety and for the safety of the rest of the homeless population. The rest of them are probably alcoholics, mentally ill, or have substance abuse problems, and they need to be treated. But once they're treated, where are they going to live? We don't have low-cost housing. We don't have low-cost apartments. One of the many people I consulted before I decided to run was Dr. Ben Carson, the former head of HUD. And he told me that he and Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, had agreed on a plan. There was a large amount of government land in California that would not be burdened by the rules and regulations, so low-cost housing could be built cheaply, and that they were going to be able to put the homeless people there. That plan did not go forward, obviously, because Donald Trump did not get a second term. But he tells me that Eric Garcetti had signed on the plan, and I've seen the plan, and it's workable. One of the things I asked Dr. Carson is this: I've been making a lot of promises if I were to get reelected, if I were to get elected a governor of California, excuse me. And one of the promises I've made is that I want to be able to get people off the ground, off the streets, put them in homes that are cost effective, and get some of them on their feet and become self-sufficient. Is that a doable promise? He said, absolutely. And he talked to me about the plan that he and Eric Garcetti had agreed upon. So I think all of this is doable.
But building homes and things of that nature would take years. And what would you do with people in the meantime?
I'm not sure it would take years. I think it would take a matter of months. Low-cost housing won't take that long to build, provided the rules and regulations that burden and jack up the cost of housing are removed. I'm not sure how long it would take, but I don't think it would take forever. I think it's an eminently doable kind of thing to do. And I would feel that if I am elected governor, and if I'm lucky enough to be put in that position, and I fail to solve the homeless problem, then I will have been a failure. I'm going to make it one of my top priorities.
All right. So our colleague Tad Weber has been patiently waiting. My apologies, Tad. I turn it back to the script and to our friend Tad Weber.
No problem, but I am going to ask two questions. So first one, Mr. Elder, you one time had told the Los Angeles Times, George Skelton, that California is ungovernable. So why, here's the first question, why do you want to become the chief executive of something that's ungovernable? And then I'll follow up when you're done answering.
Sure. I think what I told him is when I was first asked to run for office, I said, no, thank you. California is ungovernable. And by that, I meant we have a supermajority of Democrats in the Assembly, a supermajority of Democrats in the Senate. And I felt that if I were to veto something, and I would veto a lot of stuff, it would be overridden. I was wrong. I found out that a veto has not been overridden since the 1980s. And what happens when, for example, Arnold Schwarzenegger vetoed hundreds of bills, he goes to the public, he talks about why he vetoed it, he explains it, and constituents phone their state senator and phone their state assembly person and say, what were you smoking? And the veto is not overridden. And so I have a lot more power than I thought. I also have the power to declare a statewide emergency. I have the power of the line item veto. I have the power of appointing people on commissions. Many of the commissions are the ones that are imposing the rules and regulations that make life much more difficult here in California. I have the power to appoint the regions once their terms are expired, and the power to appoint people on the Public Utilities Commission. So there's a lot of power that I'll have even when dealing with a hostile legislature. And the other thing I'll have is the bully pulpit. I think I have the ability to explain things in ways that Joe and Joan Sixpack can understand. And if I do that, maybe, just maybe, I can get people to understand why we ought to rethink our attitude towards nuclear, why we need to have more underground water storage so that 50% of the water is not drained off in the Pacific Oceans, so that we can prepare for years when we have drought. I think I can explain to people that drought is God-made, but shortages are man-made in ways that I think a lot of people can't explain. And so I have a lot more power. And the more I got into this, the more I became optimistic that maybe, just maybe, somebody named Larry Elder can do a little something about some of the problems plaguing California.
Okay. In your view, was what happened at the US Capitol on January 6th an insurrection or a peaceful protest?
Please. I object to the word insurrection, but I called it a riot. Of course it was a riot. A bunch of idiots stormed the Capitol building. I guess they thought they were going to somehow be able to overturn the election. I think it was hideous, it was awful, and every single person should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Peaceful protest, come on.
All right, we will now go to...
The peaceful protest language comes from a Republican.
Well, I could give you lots of bonehead language coming from Democrats, and to impute that to you would be unfair. Don't impute that to me either.
I'm not imputing it to you. I just used it in a question. Thank you.
Fair enough.
All right, we now go to Jack Oman.
Mr. Elder, I want to apologize to you for using the phrase torrent of words. I'm somewhat used to being accused of being torrential myself, and you're a professional broadcaster, so I apologize to you. You are broadcasting currently for the Epoch Times, which is funded by the Falun Gong. Do you support the views of the Falun Gong? Do you support the Epoch Times wink and nod encouragement of QAnon?
You know, I don't know that much about either one of those things. I do know that they came to me and asked me to make videos for them, and I do. And I think the videos that I make are responsible videos. If the LA Times came to me and asked me to make videos for them, I would, but they haven't. I have been born and raised in Los Angeles. I've written a half a dozen books. 2 of them were New York Times bestsellers. 2 of them were LA Times bestsellers. The LA Times has never reviewed any of my books. I also did a documentary that came out Juneteenth last year called Uncle Tom, The Oral History of the Black Conservative. It's a Malone film directed by a friend named Justin Malone. It made more money than all of the 5 documentaries that were nominated for Best Picture combined. It had a higher IMDb rating than any of the ones that were nominated, including the one that ultimately won. The LA Times has never reviewed any of my works, never reviewed the documentary, even though I approached them. I've written over 1,000 articles since April of 1998. The LA Times has never published one. I only mention that to say that I find it interesting that I get a publication that gives a damn about some of the things I do, where my own local newspaper does not. So I'd be happy to do the videos for the LA Times if only they cared about anything that I've ever done. But the LA Times has shown not only indifference towards me, but also stridency towards me. And I think it's pretty unfair the way that I have been treated by much of the media here in California, particularly the LA Times.
Well, I'll bring it up with Sewell Chan next time I talk to him. I guess my question is, do you have some intellectual curiosity about the funding of the Epoch Times?
I've met some of their executives. They seem like reasonable people to me. And many of the articles that I've read in the Epoch Times seem like reasonable articles as well. I don't know anything about that organization that you mentioned. All I know is that they approached me. They gave me full reign to do documentaries that I think, videos that I think are sensible videos. And I've done videos about crime, about homelessness, about systemic racism, about critical race theory, about reparations, and I think they're responsible videos.
You've done about 135 videos for the Epoch Times, is that correct?
I don't know how many I've done. I've done 3 a week since I've had my relationship with them.
Okay,
and I've been with them for maybe about a year or so, so that sounds about right. I
find it rather curious that you don't know anything about the Falun Gong.
Well, I apologize for your finding it curious. I find it curious that you don't really seem to find it odd that I, Larry Elder, born and raised in South Central, my local newspaper has never published any of my columns. My local newspaper has not reviewed any of my books, even though 2 of them were on the LA Times bestseller list. My local newspaper has not at all reviewed my documentary, even though, as I pointed out, it was a critical and financial success. It seemed to me that ought to raise as much curiosity in your mind as the origins of the Epoch Times.
Well, that's a side issue. There's no question about that.
It's a side issue. I don't think it's a side issue. I think it's an important issue. One of the reasons that I believe that Democrats outnumber Republicans in this state is because people like myself are cut off, and a lot of people have never heard any of my arguments. The other day, I was talking to someone about the minimum wage, just as you have, and she was shocked to know that the New York Times one time had an editorial in 1987 that said the ideal minimum wage is 0.00. She was shocked. Well, I said, you wouldn't be shocked if you read my columns. If my columns were carried by the LA Times, maybe you wouldn't be so shocked. I think one of the reasons that this country is the way it is because commonsensical ideas like mine are shut down. And I'm accused of somehow ignoring racism, when in fact I've never ignored it. I'm accused of all sorts of hideous things because a lot of people have never heard things I've had to say. There's a publication called Ebony Magazine. For a time, virtually every Black family had it on the coffee table. It was a staple of the Black family. My family had Ebony Magazine on the coffee table every month from the 50s. And every year they had a feature called the 100 Most Influential Black Americans. And every year absent were Clarence Thomas, even though however you feel about his ideology, by definition, he's influential as one of 9 members of the Supreme Court. Every year omitted was Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell is the brilliant economist. He's still with us. He's published over 40 books, including one called Basic Economics. Every year missing is the late Walter Williams. He, to my knowledge, was the only Black person to become the chairman of an economics department of a non-historically Black college. These 3 men completely omitted from Ebony Magazine, and as a result, a lot of Black people have no idea about their thoughts, about their ideas, and that's one of the reasons, in my opinion, we have this problem where we're not talking about the breakdown of the Black family. We're not talking about poor urban schools. We're talking about things that to me are not even relevant.
Well, I would say the St. Paul Pioneer Press has evinced very little interest in my own career, sorry to say.
Well, with all due respect, Walter Williams and Thomas Sowell are legends.
No, I'm well aware who they are.
David
Walter
Mamet,
Williams Was he not chairman at George Mason of economics? Is
He
that correct?
was. He was.
Okay.
He was.
And so you went to Fairfax High School, if I'm not mistaken, and my family went to West Springfield High School, so I'm not completely off your planet here.
Well,
But
actually, if I may, I went to 4 high schools.
Sure.
I went to Washington, Crenshaw, Dorsey, and Fairfax. And one of the reasons you mentioned Fairfax, that I'm a proponent of school choice, is because of my semester at Fairfax. I thought I was a genius. I thought I was brilliant. I thought I was a world beater. I always made A's at Crenshaw until I was bused to Fairfax for one semester. And when I walked in class, these kids, and most of them were Jewish. I mentioned that only because Yom Kippur took place and you could come to school if you wanted to or not come to school. Only 2 people came to school during that period of time. I walk into class, Spanish that first day, and these kids were fluent. I mean, I was stunned. My jaw dropped. I did not believe you could learn how to speak a language fluently in a classroom setting. Excuse me. But because the academic rigor was so different from Crenshaw to Fairfax, I realized that these kids had a far more rigorous academic understanding, approach, and demands on them than I did. And I came home that first day and I was crying. And I told my mother I felt I had gotten ripped off. My mother started crying and she said, you know, your father and I should have put you in a better school, but we did not have the money. Maybe someday you'll be able to grow up and do something about it. Well, that someday is here. And that's why I'm a strong proponent of school choice. I believe the money should follow the child rather than the other way around, so that somebody living within a certain geographical radius of Crenshaw High School won't have to send their kid to a school where only 2% are math proficient, and a school that is dominated by a gang called the Crips. I know that because Ice-T, I interviewed him later on. He told me he chose Crenshaw because he wanted to go to a school that was a Crip school. Now, I believe it is outrageous to be mandated to send your kid to a school like that if there's a choice. Barack Obama lived in Indonesia with his mom and his stepfather, and he attended a private school run by oil company executives because his stepfather was an oil company executive. But that school wasn't good enough. His mom sent him to Hawaii so he could attend the finest prep school in the state. And then after he graduated, he came to Los Angeles, where for 2 years he went to Occidental, finished up at an Ivy League school, Columbia, and then he goes to Harvard Law School. Michelle Robinson, his future wife, while she did not go to a private high school, she got on a bus to escape her local high school. Then she went to Princeton, and then she went to Harvard. The girls, Sasha and Malia, they benefited from private school that was run by the teachers at University of Chicago, where Obama was for a while an instructor. And then when they moved to Washington, D.C., they went to the girls went to Sidwell Friends, the same prep school that that Chelsea Clinton went to. That's about $44,000. So the girls never set foot in a public school. Obama never set foot in a public school. And for all intents and purposes, Michelle Robinson went to what we now would call a charter school or a magnet school. Yet the Democratic Party does not support school choice. I find that absolutely astounding. And the fact that Black and brown parents still pull that lever year after year after year for the Democratic Party is amazing to me. What's the first step toward escaping poverty? Going to a quality high school, one where presumably you can read, write, and compute at grade level.
So why don't we are at time, Mr. Elder. So if I could have all the panelists mute themselves, please. We are at time. We thank you very much for your time over the last hour. And we wish you well, you and your staff. So at this point, if our producer could stop recording, please. And then we will, if all the panelists could sign off, we'll wish Mr. Elder a good rest of his day. Thank you very much.